1 year, I worked most of my life, in fact, for almost 40 years with the UN in various jobs and functions, and also partly with the European Union. But anyway, and I was for 1 year a special representative for Western Sahara with Kofi Annan. Before I start, I thought I really feel that I would like to express my, let's say, pay homage to the memory of a person who left us just 3 or 4 weeks ago, Mahmoud Haddad, who was a person who really competent, hardworking, visionary leader of the Sahrawi cause. He has left us recently. It's been a tremendous loss for the people of Western Sahara, and in fact for all those who really have been advocating their cause, who have been participating in this struggle. So it's a really sorry farewell, we have to say, to a great personality. On the question of the United Nations, you will hear me criticize the organization because I think it deserves it on the question of Western Sahara. My criticism should not be taken to extend to the many other things and activities of the organization on so many different topics in so many different parts of the world. I think, in fact, generally the UN would deserve a better reputation that it has normally. But I also think that on the question of Western Sahara, the UN is really failing miserably in its responsibilities. And I think that being loyal to the principles and the Charter of the United Nations sometimes also requires to be critical, even if for those who believe profoundly on the values of the United Nations. So that's what I'm doing in a way. Other speakers have addressed the matter, and I'm quite sure that all those who are listening in are familiar with the rather complex history of the Western Sahara saga, so I will not go through the entire past ups and downs of this question. Of course, my perspective will be from the United Nations point of view, and I will do, as it was mentioned, in 2 installments. The first part will be, I will highlight some points in time, some aspects of the history of Western Sahara in the UN that in my view are particularly revealing, emblematic of the failure of the UN to resolve the question. And then I go into presenting the reasons for this failure of the UN. And then I stop there if there are some questions and so on. Then the second part would be about looking into the future, what could be done to somehow wake this, set into motion a more proper and responsible behavior on the part of the organization and, generally speaking, of the international community. So as I start off, it's important to remind us all of the key role of the United Nations. The importance of the UN vis-à-vis the Western Sahara issue cannot be overemphasized. The UN is crucial. It's crucial because of the mandate of the Security Council on all matters of international peace and security. So the UN is the political dossier rests with the Security Council. Action or inaction of the Security Council is fundamental in relation to settling the issue of Western Sahara. And also, of course, there are all sorts of other related challenges, human rights, human resources, development, and so on, where there are mandates of the United Nations that are relevant to the challenges confronted by Western Sahara and its people. So the UN is at the center in many ways, particularly on the political dimension of the question, which is ultimately what matters most, although there are many other aspects to it. Now, I will pull out from the history of Western Sahara in the UN 3 or 4 episodes to better explain the causes, in my view, of the inaction, incapacity organization to really address, as it should, this question and resolve it. The United Nations began recognizing what goes under the definition of the inalienable rights of the Sahrawi people to self-determination already in the 1960s, when Spain was still, of course, the colonial power there. Since the 1960s to this day, the United Nations has adopted hundreds of resolutions, General Assembly, Security Council, various committees, reiterating, every time reasserting that the people of Western Sahara have an inalienable right to self-determination. This is what the UN Charter provides for, and this is what, since the time of the decolonization movement led by or facilitated by the UN, has been the basic building block for this issue. So here we have the first instance in 1975, when Spain, 75-76, Spain was withdrawing ungloriously from the territory, when presumably, given the past history, the resolution and all the rest, was the moment where the Sahrawis would be empowered and allowed to exercise via referendum or anything else their free right to determine their own future. But this was not what happened. In 75, within a few days, some interesting development took place, and very unfortunate development, because basically there was first an advisory, you know these things, but it's bear repeating, an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice stating that the Sahrawis had the right to self-determination, and that Moroccan claims of sovereignty were not founded on history, on any credible argument from the juridical point of view. So the tribunal reiterated in this advisory opinion the fact that there was no impediment to the exercise of the right to self-determination. The following day, I believe, the next day from the day when this opinion was made public, we had the Green March. King Hassan II launched this tens of thousands of Moroccans and military, of course, and citizens to occupy the territory. And from there on, we had the situation of a conflict with Frente Polisario and so on. Now, what is interesting from a UN point of view for what happened in those days is first that the Security Council or the organization did not really have any forceful response to this illicit move on the part of Morocco in forcibly entering a country or a territory that was entitled to self-determination. And next to it, there are records that have become public ever since that show how the set was already determined for the way for the next decades the UN would handle the question. There was made public some years ago a conversation that took place in Washington between then President Ford and then Secretary of State Kissinger. These are records that are under US practices are made public after a certain period of time, where Ford turned to Kissinger and said, I had understood that Western Sahara will go to Morocco. And Kissinger said, yes, this is the understanding, if necessary, through a rigged UN vote. This is the expression, rigged UN vote. Now, I mentioned this because the formula used by Kissinger implies already a sort of understanding among key players within the UN, and possibly even an understanding with the Secretariat and with the executive branch, that no matter what, things will be managed in a way that Western Sahara will go to Morocco. I'm saying this because this is the fit from day one. Now, and we have to confront these things, however unpleasant, because it's to overcome them, or to overcome this mindset and political resistance, one has to confront the hard facts. Let's go forward. We jump to 1991, the launch of MINURSO, a mission that was agreed upon in the Security Council to, as you all know probably, to do two things: monitor the ceasefire between Polisario and the Moroccans, and organize a referendum for the self-determination of the people of Western Sahara. Now, this referendum was supposed to be held within 9 months of the launching of the mission. It didn't turn out to be that way. As you know, MINURSO is still not holding the referendum. What is interesting there again, in UN terms, besides the launch of the mission, is the fact that it became fairly soon evident that the mission was unable to fulfill its main mandate, the referendum, because there was no appetite on the part of Morocco to ensure the referendum was held. Of course, the reasons were seen to be technical. There was disagreement on who could vote, couldn't vote in the referendum, and so on. But the thing dragged on for years, and it was obvious that the lack of agreement on who could vote or not vote was the expression of something that was much more political than technical. There was no appetite for a referendum. There again, no particular appetite on the part of the Security Council or other UN actors to force a more responsible behavior. Instead, the UN went back to the drawing board with the after years of back and forth, with the appointment of former US Secretary of State James Baker, a very powerful, let's say, figure, in also because of his nationality. Now, Baker worked on the issue well for a number of years, and we go forward a bit more to 2003, when James Baker produced what, in fact, was a second version, but anyway, what goes under the name of Baker Plan. The Baker Plan consisted of a blueprint for resolving the question of Western Sahara. I don't go into the details, but basically, after certain interim measures, the Baker Plan envisaged the referendum where the Sahrawis would choose between three possible options. One was annexation, integration into Morocco. The second was autonomy under Moroccan sovereignty, and the third was independence. The Baker Plan was submitted by the Secretary General to the Security Council. The Security Council in 2003 considered it and agreed. That's a unique situation in the history of Western Sahara and the Security Council. The Security Council agreed that the Baker Plan was the best possible solution to resolve the impasse in Western Sahara. When we say this, it's very important to emphasize this was a unanimous position of the Council, to which concurred also countries like France, the United States. Everybody agreed this was the best possible way to handle and resolve the Western Sahara challenge. Now, the plan then was passed on to the parties. Polisario agreed to it, had some reservation, but basically agreed to it. And in 2004, it was Morocco that said, no matter what, whatever formula that includes at its end the possibility of the independence of Western Sahara is not acceptable to Rabat. So Morocco rejected it. There again, what is interesting also from a point of view of what the UN or how the UN handles this is the response. When Morocco said no to the plan, which was not Baker's plan anymore, was in a way the plan of the Security Council, there was basically no response, either individually or collectively. Security Council members did not really react. Of course, there was an expression of concern or something like this, yes, but nothing in terms of either forcing Morocco to comply and do the right thing and allowing these people to exercise their UN Charter recognized right to a referendum and self-determination, or any sanctions for refusing to comply. These are examples, and you can take from more recent developments many such examples. You might be familiar with other actions by Morocco in recent years that were condoned or passed over by the United Nations. Now, what all the meaning of all this, in a way, in different ways, ends up being one and one only, that basically there is total impunity for Morocco within the United Nations for its actions in Western Sahara. There are sometimes some little concerns or little ups and downs, but basically the feeling of observers and the conviction, I'm afraid, in Morocco is that they can get away with things, impunity. Now, and we will then see why it is so. But anyway, that's in political terms, the general sense of the challenge. Now, as the situation since, let's say, after the rejection of the Baker Plan and so on, substantively and politically has not changed. Basically, you have a situation where Morocco offers a sort of autonomy for Western Sahara under Moroccan sovereignty, is something not very well defined and not very credible, but anyway, that's Morocco's position. And the Sahrawis understandably claim that it doesn't make sense to talk about any process of self-determination, excluding a priori the possibility that the choice goes for independence. I mean, it's rather obvious in the light of the whole history of the colonization. Besides this, the process also is basically stalled recently because the last personal representative of the Secretary General, in the person of former German President Köhler, resigned almost 1 year ago from the position for health reasons and possibly also for lack of success or inadequate movement forward. And direct negotiations or contacts between the parties are suspended. So we are in a block, in a sort of paralysis. And this kind of paralysis on and off have been a recurrent feature of the UN, let's say, role and handling of the question of Western Sahara. Now, the next question, and then maybe I take some, if you want to ask something, is why is it so? Why is it so? Why is the UN failing so totally and utterly in giving the Sahrawi people their dues? Why is it tolerating this, which is not just a political challenge, which is a daily outrage of violation of human rights, of trampling on the basic and essential necessities of a people that through no fault of their own? Now, the reason is this, which you know, is that there are a few very powerful countries that have at heart that are protecting the interest of Morocco in the United Nations. There are a few very influential governments that, no matter what, want to protect the interest of Morocco in this question. Among them, there are two permanent members of the Security Council, which is France and the United States, who therefore are very instrumental to making sure that the Council never moves against Moroccan interest when it debates the UN involvement in Western Sahara. And parallel to that, and in general, there is another informal arrangement in the UN that I think should be known and not everybody knows about, which is very important, the way the UN handles or mishandles Western Sahara. Just called the Group of Friends. It's called the Group of Friends of the Secretary General on Western Sahara. It's made up of 5 countries. These 5 countries are, of course, France and the United States, Spain, United Kingdom, and Russia. What does this Group of Friends do? This Group of Friends basically meets informally prior to discussion in the Council, in the General Assembly, and prepare a bit the scenario. They draft the resolution, decide what the main points should be, you know, who makes what points, what should or shouldn't be included in the final conclusions of the deliberation. Because in the UN, like in all such bodies, what matters is not the meeting itself, is what happens prior, the arrangements that are agreed upon before the meetings or the discussion actually takes place in the open. So this group is extremely influential in setting the tone and you know, putting the parameters of the discussion. Now, what is striking in this group, come to think of it, of course, is that first, there is not a single African country, and after all, Western Sahara happens to be in Africa. There is not a single country that really, except in a way the United States, has lived through the experience of the colonization, because and basically is a reflection of a very ancient and patronizing notion, almost neo-colonialist approach to handling an issue that all these countries see through the lenses of their own national interest and their alliances with Morocco. This group is a scandal, and in fact should also be an embarrassment to the Secretary General. I mean, they, of course, he cannot disband them because this is a voluntary group, it's not a formal entity, but indeed is a very awkward, very insulting in a way presence in UN proceedings. Now, this is one half of the problem. In other words, few countries are interested, and those few countries that are interested for different reasons are very much on the side of Morocco. Now, on the question of the reasons, I don't go into that because, but it's interesting because reasons differ. The reason why why Spain is totally committed no matter what to Morocco, or why France is, or the United States is, differ in some ways. Some are more economic, other are security related, other have to do with migration or with illicit drugs or with the exploitation of natural resources. But no matter what considerations there are for Spain, there is also the question of the Spanish enclaves and so on, but they all come to the same end result, that is this unquestioning, blind and absolute support of the Moroccan position. The second half of the problem in the UN is the others. The UN has 200 member states. Now, vis-a-vis this small group that dictates the agenda, there is a problem of inaction by others, including sometimes those countries. There are 54 countries that recognize the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic as the legitimate representative of the people of Western Sahara. But even those governments very often are not really active in UN circles. You know, there is sometimes I blame more those passive, that silent majority, rather than those handful of countries that for no reason are at all costs supporting Morocco. Where are the champions of human rights, the Scandinavians? Where are some African countries? Why don't they speak up? So, because they are part of the problem sometimes, as much as those that are playing the game for Morocco. This is insulting also, and I think is not easily tolerable. The last point, and then we take some questions, is the another point. And by the way, you have similar situation in the European Union. You know, you have also in the European Union what I call roped party leaders, like when you climb the mountain. You know, there is the decision of how you go up is entrusted to the one or two persons on top of the party going up. Now, in the EU, like in the UN, you find Spain, you find France, and so on, and all other member states delegate to them the decision on how to go about things. And by the way, that's a problem, because the decisions are made on the basis of the sovereign interest of individual countries, not the overall interest of the UN, the overall obligation of the European Union, and so on. So the policies of this international organization is in fact dictated by the national interests of those three countries that call the tone. Now, another point that I want to make before I finish on this. One of the challenges confronted by the Western Sahara issue is that it is all too often seen as subsidiary to other problems. In other words, instead of being taken in its own merits, it's a country, it's a process of decolonization, it's an oppressed people. You know, there are clear positions about it in the UN Charter. It's a standalone issue. No, all too often, member states and also the Secretariat of the United Nations see Western Sahara as one element. You know, you cannot antagonize France over that question because you need France or something else that you need to do, I don't know, in Burkina Faso, or because of something that you need to do on an issue that is more urgent or more immediate. In other words, there is always a sort of a order of priority, or things that are more urgent, or things that come first, that often have a negative cost for the question of Western Sahara. This approach also is utterly unacceptable. It doesn't work that way. There are no issues that are bigger or smaller when it comes to basic human rights, when it comes to give a people the legitimate use of an entitlement that is as absolute as the one of self-determination. So this is another mindset that has to be fought. And very often within the Secretariat, I was confronting this. That is basically, yeah, you know, Western Sahara, you know, there are some people being shot somewhere else, so there is a problem in that other region of the world. You know, it's not the time to pester Paris or Washington over this. This is not a way of reasoning that can be acceptable, either in terms of law or in terms of humanity. I'll stop here because maybe it's already a lot. And then the second part, after you might have some questions, will be on what I see as a possible way forward. And I think there is a way forward, by the way, because I don't want to sound too gloomy. Of course, it's a big issue and very unnecessarily complicated. But anyway, the second part will talk about what, in my view, is being done or could be done to settle it. So if there is any question. I start this second part by highlighting one thing that I think is very important and encouraging, which is the extraordinary results and successes that the Sahrawi cause, by the way, also thanks to a very large extent to the gentleman I mentioned earlier, and Ahmed Haddad, the successes that Sahrawis have achieved in many courts of law throughout the world, in many tribunals, national tribunals, European courts, and so on. These successes, which is a relatively recent development, are extremely important. These are successes related to the legitimacy of Morocco's exploitation of natural resources of Western Sahara, which of course, this dates back to Roman, as Pedro surely know, to Roman law. The fact that an occupying power cannot dispose freely of the resources of a land it occupies, and so on. These victories are important first because, for instance, take the question of phosphates, where, for instance, even courts in South Africa have taken action and so on. First of all, because they either make it very difficult or blockade Morocco's access to resources, or they create problems on the agreements that Morocco, and then shameful behavior of European Union, by the way, one talks about the UN, but anyway, on these agreements that the European Union is subscribing and trying it desperately, including with the collusion of the Commission, to carry forward with Morocco. Shameful. Europeans that are pretending to lead the way on legality, and anyway, forget, let's not get emotional. But so these victories are important because they address these issues and try to redress them. But secondly, they are important because they are also a reminder to all that Morocco's presence is illegal, that they, by acting in this way, by exporting phosphates, by giving access to the territorial waters of the Western Sahara to European fishing vessels, whatever, they acting against the law because their presence there is against the law, and because there is a pending issue that is not being resolved. So there is also a kind of political connotation to all this, which is also very important. And in fact, I think that through these successes, I think the Sahrawis have accrued a sort of capital from a legal and juridical point of view that is now to be transferred as an asset into the political discourse. And that's the challenge, to use all these statements and these achievements through the course of law as a tool to be deployed on the political challenge. And frankly, ultimately, the whole question is political, of course. So how do we do it? And we come now to the first thing, which is implicit in what I said earlier, is to draw more governments into an active engagement on Western Sahara within the United Nations, convince them that they should be engaged. There are things that are happening in that sense. I give you just one example. This Geneva group. Recently in Geneva, there's been established a group of friends of Western Sahara for human rights. It's about a dozen countries. There is a very important role played by South Africa. This is an effort that has been also sustained by the American Association of Jurists and so on. Now, this group in Geneva is quite active. The focus is mostly on human rights, but is a potential alternative, as it will deploy also fully in New York and so on, of balancing presence to the group of friends I was mentioning earlier. In other words, we need more countries that get engaged, and get engaged not because they want to go fishing in Western Sahara or because they want to not to have migrants coming, but they get engaged because they want to uphold certain principle of international relations. That is, in other words, they get engaged for the right reason. So there is some movement, and I gave you that example. I think this more countries should be involved, and how to further this trend, I think one has to have certain arguments on hand. And what are these arguments? So what arguments to use with countries to urge them to care, to prepare themselves when discussion comes up in the General Assembly, and to advocate for the values of the United Nations? One argument, of course, which is underlying all this, is because it's right. I mean, you are a member of, you are committed to the values and principles of the Charter, you are committed to human rights, you are committed to honor the obligations to decolonization. That's why you should do this, because it's the right thing to do. But be more practical. You can narrow this. You can look at it on the question of human rights. I think a lot of the Scandinavians, for instance. I mean, so leave aside the political, that's interesting. Forget about the politics, forget about the referendum. Forget about what will happen ultimately. Meantime, there is an issue every day of human rights. Meantime, every day there is an issue of exploitation of natural resources. Every day there is an issue of muscling these people, of jailing them, or beating them, or whatever. Let's look at that without prejudice of what will be ultimately the political response. Okay, so arguments of this nature will reassure those that are doubtful. We are not asking you to decide whether Western Sahara should become independent or not. We are just asking you to care for human rights. Okay. Another argument that is important is conflict prevention. In the UN, there is a lot of rhetoric, even too much, about conflict prevention. Preventing conflict is much cheaper in terms of human lives, in terms of money, in terms of political capital. We all know this. Once a conflict is underway, it's much more complicated to address and resolve it. So preventing conflict should be a priority, is stated as a priority of the UN. Well, the argument goes, Western Sahara is a textbook case of conflict prevention. I mean, is really, if one were to make a theory around Western Sahara, it's exactly a case of conflict prevention. The unresolved issue of Western Sahara can lead to conflict. Now it could be tackled with the due manners, but if you don't, there is a threat, a pending threat. Okay, so that should convince some member states who have the right thinking to look into this and try to move now until before things get worse. And that brings to another argument, which is one of regional security, because there is a distorted reasoning saying don't touch Western Sahara because otherwise it's very unsettling in terms of regional security. I think, in fact, the opposite is true. There is an appearance of stability in the Maghreb region, but frankly, the unresolved question of Western Sahara is a threat. It's not a matter of, take for instance, the Maghreb Union. Maghreb Union is supposed to build, regional development, to improve security cooperation, all the rest, and is completely frozen because mostly of the Western Sahara issues and so on. So even in terms of security and stability and peace in the region, I think there are plenty of reasons to try and address and resolve this. Now, coming to a bit more, I don't know how much time is left. There are a few things that I think are important. One is, how do you enter into this country system and try to urge more active engagement on the right side of the issue? I think an entry point that is being used, but as a great potential, is parliament. I have the impression, and actually I've seen throughout the world, that parliaments and parliamentarians tend to be much more open to the argument of the Sahrawi cause. Because parliamentarians, maybe also by nature of their work, are more keen on arguments of justice, of legality, of what the law says, of what the international agreements represent. So parliamentarians are more open, very often, than the executive branches of government that are more political. So parliaments can be leveraged more as tools to bring pressure on the executives, on governments to engage. I give you an example to be more practical. Take the United States, okay? In 2016, there was a meeting of the special session of the US Commission on Human Rights of the US Congress, Lantos Commission is the name, I think. Now, this is a bipartisan commission of the United States Congress that met, discussed Western Sahara, and adopted the resolution urging the United States government to move to protect the human rights of the people of Western Sahara and to ensure that Sahrawis can freely exercise their right to self-determination. It's an example. Of course, one can say, well, the State Department has not really heard this that much, but there is more and more potential to, as I say, leverage parliaments, and not just in the United States, but in many other countries, to become partners and players in this respect. Then the last point, which actually is rather long, but there is no time, so because it was touched by you. Besides what you do with governments, I think a new look should be taken at the whole way that the issue is handled within the United Nations. The United Nations is a universe One knows about the Security Council, something about the General Assembly, but there are all sorts of commissions, expert groups, specialized agencies with different mandates. And many of these mandates are relevant to the Sahrawi cause. So the Sahrawi cause has to be pursued more vigorously in all these different fora. And I give you the example of Security Council. I think there's been a bit of a fixation with Security Council. Of course, it's understandable because of MINURSO, because of, but the Council is probably the most hostile environment to the cause of Western Sahara. One should not give up on insisting on enlargement of the mandate of MINURSO. But at the same time, on the question, for instance, of human rights, one can pursue exactly the same agenda in other fora. And I think Pedro was mentioning, in other words, you have, you could perfectly well have a resolution of the General Assembly asking the Secretary General of the United Nations to report once a year to the General Assembly the kind of information that is due for all non-self-governing territories and is provided for other non-self-governing territories by the administering powers. That, again, this is a bit complicated, but Western Sahara has no administering power, thanks to Spain. So why shouldn't the Secretary General fill in, pending the political resolution, and provide once a year information on human rights, education, health, economic conditions, as it is done with other non-self-governing territories, so that you have a discussion that, because now the discussion in the UN is a discussion on a people really faceless. There is no substance, is purely political, even in the General Assembly. It's the same report that goes to the Council, goes to the General Assembly. Now, there is in chapter 11 of the UN Charter a whole list of obligations. It's called Sacred Trust of the international community towards non-self-governing territories. And this relates, human rights is not mentioned too openly because the UN Charter was written at a time when this was not such a top priority, but there is everything else. There is some reference to freedom of expression. There is definitely economic development, institution building, the logic being that pending self-determination, the international community has an obligation to these people to ensure that they get health, education, that they get freedom of expression, political organization, pending the access to whatever future they will define for themselves. All this is not happening. In this respect, it's another total inaction. These things can be pursued totally outside the Security Council, totally outside changing the mandate of MINURSO. There's nothing to do. And it's much easier, in my view, at least to try, because in the General Assembly, as it was mentioned, there is no veto power. You make decision by majority vote, and these are non-political. In other words, as I said earlier, you can tell many countries, look, I'm not asking you to say that you are pro or against Morocco. I'm just asking you to say that you're concerned about human rights in the territory or in the refugee camps, and let's have a resolution asking the Secretary General to make a report once a year as it is done for other territories of the nature. There is also the question, I have to stop, I assume, because it's time. There's also the question of development. Back then, when there was this question with the Palestinians, I see often this discussion connects with the Palestinian situation. There was a time when there was no Palestinian authorities or anything of the sort, when through the General Assembly, we pushed, and also UNDP, pushed the launch of what goes, I don't even know if it still exists, PAP, Program of Assistance to the Palestinian People, PAP. Now, this PAP was at the time when there was no Palestinian authority or whatever, but where the General Assembly recognized that pending a political settlement, the international community had an obligation toward a people, not even in the notion of a, and a program was established and resources were made available and whatever. This is another totally, I think much more needs to be done in that respect. And I finish on one point. It is true that, for instance, when the decolonization committee discusses this matter once a year with the same basis as the discussion that takes place in the council, which is wrong, because the council, the decolonization committee should look at chapter 11 and worry about the practicalities of what's happening or not happening or what should be done. There is a appearance, there are these so-called petitioners. There are people who go there and read, denounce Morocco. Then there are the pro-Moroccans that denounce Polisario. But politically, this doesn't impact. It does not. I'm sorry to say, because I know many people care for it and like to go and say their bit, but it doesn't wash. What is needed is a strategic approach prior to the meetings to prepare resolutions, to lobby with governments, to ask for specific responses from the Secretary General, to lobby for a vote, and to have a decision that triggers and forces the executive to take action. Okay, and this is the work that again is building up, but I think there is a great potential. And similarly, things of that nature could happen in various specialized agencies of the UN and so on. Frankly, there is no silver bullet, but I think that, and many of these things are being increasingly pursued, but I think there is a great potential for more. Maybe I'll just stop here. It's over, no? What time? We finish? No.
Thank you, Francesco. I think we can have a few more questions. We have about 15, 16 minutes. And I will continue in the order that they were asked on the last questions session, because people are very curious, I think. I'm very curious too. I wish we could do another hour, because I think everyone can ask you a lot. But anyway, next question is from Magdalena, if you're still with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Bastagli. We met a few years ago in the camps, and I was very fascinated at your radical opinion in terms of the United Nations. I want to say that I'm also very delighted that Professor Yahya Zabir is here. You know, my concern rests in the fact that we are having so much of dependency on MINURSO. And if MINURSO is what we believe it to be, if MINURSO is really that institution that's unable to give us what we want, which it hasn't been able to, I don't believe that there's a blind support for Morocco, because Morocco's support really comes through patronage, as you've indicated. I think the other issue is that MINURSO really hasn't been able to deliver on its mandate. So yes, I agree with the sentiments in terms of the United Nations, the Security Council that you have. However, what I want to say is the issue of colonization. I think what we are doing is, as opposed to being able, respectfully so, to attend to the issue of colonization, we need to attend to the issue that Spain, MINURSO, are simply decorative diplomacy. And we need to remove the mentality of a decorative diplomacy in order to create peace. The Sahrawi people are not a conflictual people. My view would be to say, how do we redirect? Because the real intention in the conflict that exists is the issue of economic power. How do we redirect that economic power out of the hands of Morocco and back to the Sahrawi people? For me, I think one of the things that we are missing, I do understand MINURSO's role and the taking over from the African Union, but what I want to appeal is that if we can collectively join forces and insist that the African Union, being a custodian over the Western Sahara, being a member state of the Constitutive Act, hold Morocco responsible and kick Morocco out. The issue of the blockade is another issue, but my view is that it is indeed, yes, a humanitarian crisis, but over and above being a humanitarian or political crisis, the bottom line is that this is an economic fight that Morocco is exercising through its friends. And my view is that if we have 5 states who are friends and 200 states, 200 member states in the UN, it's not impossible to try and reinforce the economic redirection of power back to the Sahrawi people.
Thank you, Magdalena. I have many
you.
questions, if you can round up. Do you want to respond to that, Francesco?
So yes, just let me then talk a little more about MINURSO. I really, having been head of MINURSO, I think one of the efforts that all should make is to get their mind off MINURSO for a while. MINURSO is stuck, okay? And in all likelihood will remain so until the day politically MINURSO or whoever will be there will be able to hold a referendum or to fulfill the mandate. But MINURSO as such, I give you an example because otherwise, when I was head of MINURSO, one thing one should know about MINURSO, the head of MINURSO is not the head of MINURSO. There is a person that's called Special Representative of the Secretary General for Western Sahara. And then there is another person called Personal Representative of the Secretary General for Western Sahara. The personal representative, Mr. Köhler, handles the political dossier, resolving the issue. The special representative who sits in Laayoune and is head of MINURSO is, however, special representative of the Secretary General. So my argument was, with Kofi Annan and member states, being the representative of the Secretary General means that whoever sits there should look at all concerns of the United Nations in any country, in this case, in Western Sahara. Anything that is UN mandate should be of interest of someone who represents the Secretary General, okay? So the idea was that definitely you had MINURSO, but why not have a special representative also look at human rights or any other concern? It's an example of that. The fact is it doesn't work. Why doesn't work? Because MINURSO needs Morocco to operate, okay? First, in practical terms, MINURSO is hosted by Morocco. To save money, the UN is accepting to some extent even the hospitality in the premises of MINURSO. We operate planes. We have to fly in and out of the desert to service the military observer post and so on. We have to fly in and out of Laayoune. In other words, the mechanics of the military observer function rely absolutely in Morocco's willingness to allow it. The moment you, as a representative of the UN there, stray from the notion of MINURSO as a technical military observer mission, you get hit. You know, when I started off, my understanding in New York was that I would discreetly raise some concerns of matters that were not flying the Antonov planes back and forth. And after a few months, I mean, I'm not saying it to glorify, but you know, Morocco asked Kofi Annan to pull me out. You know, after me and by the way, the force commander was a very competent Danish general. Morocco wrote to Kofi Annan, we want them out because they're mixing things that have nothing to do with them. Okay, because I raised maybe a kind of it was the end of Ramadan, some political prisoners maybe could be in the spirit of Ramadan let out of the Castle Negra or something like this. They were like this, and not just them, by the way, but France. France is even sometimes it was easier to talk to the Moroccans than talking to the French. It was incredible, as President Trump would say. It was incredible, and so then you settle for something because then New York headquarters tells you, look, you have to make sure that MINURSO carries on with whatever they have to do, and therefore stay out of these issues that go beyond the mandate. So this is just to give you a taste of why. On the other hand, and I repeat it, there are other ways. In the fourth committee, you're talking about colonization. There is a committee of the General Assembly that is about decolonization, that discusses Western Sahara every year, along with Guam and other non-self-governing territories. That's the avenue. That's the avenue. Forget MINURSO for a moment. That's the avenue. Let MINURSO be. That's where you can process resolutions and where there is no veto power. And when the African countries that care can vote for it, asking for, as I said, there is one of the tremendous things, there is no information. Of course, there is information coming from NGOs, there is information coming on and off in Geneva on specific human rights cases, but it's not an overall view of what happens to these people, day in and day out, but that would give some flesh and blood to the discussion of Western Sahara in the UN. In the UN, Western Sahara is discussed in a very rarefied and strictly political empyrean, where 3 or 4 member states decides not to do anything. So you have to bring it up, force it down. So why you said African Union? African Union, frankly, had a very key role in the early days, but with all due respect, is not very exciting. You know, the African Union, and that's problem for even going to a vote in the General Assembly. African Union, in spite of Western Sahara membership, now Morocco is in and so on, you've seen what has happened recently when the 5 or 6 African countries opened consulates in Western Sahara. So to what extent, on the other hand, you have countries like South Africa that are extremely consistent and committed. You had this Mr. Chisano, who's a special envoy. I hope he's still there. I don't know if he's still on that position, who's a very influential political figure in Africa. But the African Union also finds it very difficult to speak with one voice on Western Sahara. And one of the reasons, I think, just to why it's difficult for the say African Union to demand, for instance, to have a presence in the group of friends, is because probably within the African Union countries there is no consensus who should that be. So the realities of politics, even in terms of African Union, are complex, they are complicated, and that's why handling this within a UN multilateral environment requires a lot of groundwork, counting the votes, how you write a text, what's the language that would more likely to build consensus around, who will vote yes or no, who will help us push this through. All this groundwork in part is being done, but there is a tremendous, I know it sounds tedious and bureaucratic, that's the way it works. And as to the fact that it is economic issues and so on, I agree with all this, but who can make these things happen? It always goes back to this question. How can you reorient toward the economic sphere and make sure that Spain engages, and all these things go back to the fact that we need more voices, we need more rightful governments, honest and straight thinking and committed governments to engage and become proactive within the UN system, and not just there, also in the European Union.
Indeed, maybe we should have a session on how to make all of this happen as well. We have very few minutes left, so let's make the questions very short. Jackson, do you have a question? We can't hear you, Jackson, but I see that you unmuted yourself. Okay, it looks like you're having some problems with the mic. We will move to the next one. I'm sorry, because we are out of time. Hamza, do you want to ask your question?
We are losing our audience. I see.
Yeah, we're almost at the end. Okay. Sid Ahmed, do you want to ask your question?
Everyone is left speechless.
Everything is so clear. There is,
yeah.
Maybe they have dropped. Julia, sorry, I can't pronounce the name. Do you want to ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me? It's okay?
Yes.
We hear you.
Okay. Yes, great, and thanks to Bastagli for the conference. It's always interesting to listen to him. Not only one question is about the how your opinion about the position of the European Union and the recent judgment of the Court of Justice. Is maybe is a hope for go ahead?
A hope for?
Is a maybe could be a key for unlocking the situation in current condition. Maybe is a good path for unlocking.
Look, I don't follow very closely all the various ups and downs within the European Union over the challenges that are being brought forward by the Sahrawis, assisted by a very competent team of lawyers and friends, to the various agreements, the various measures, agreements between Morocco and the EU, various arrangements that have been. So I don't know. I know I've followed the one on the fisheries. I know this question of the marking of experts and all these tricks that are, you know, for instance, I was reading, actually the last time I spoke to Haddad, we were talking about that, how produce from Western Sahara gets rerouted through Spain to being sold then as produced in Spain and so on. I mean, there is a lot of, now there is a lot going on to try to resist this, and successful. And as I said earlier, it's very important. It gives also psychologically a boost, which is much needed, but also a sense, as I say, one of the strengths of all this is that the problem is not going away. I mean, this might sound rather limited, but it's not limited. I mean, the problem is as dramatic, as urgent, as unresolved as it was in 1975. It doesn't go away. And the challenge is a challenge that will have to be confronted. And some of these rulings and so on are very, let's say, emblematic of this. Now, how this, as I said earlier, can turn into a political asset, I really don't know. It's important. These things are all relevant. They pertain to certain more economic and trade aspects. And on the other hand, to be frank, how much these things will impact on the political standing of countries like France and the United States is problematic. I think the pressure at that level has to come from other countries, from other influential countries or other group of countries through other means. But anyway, of course, these rulings are very encouraging and very important, and I think great progress has been made in this particular sphere in the last few years, and this is very promising.
All right, the session has now gone on for 1 hour and 28 minutes. So Francesco, if you want to say any final words, because we have to end with the question and answer session. I'm sorry for those of you who still have questions, but we're out of time.
Look, yeah. My conclusion is this. First of all, and I am comforted in this by seeing our Sahrawi friends and this very convinced and dedicated movement around the world in support to the Sahrawi cause. The context is complex, and the challenge is not simple. In fact, the matter is extremely simple, but it has been made into something very complicated. But on the other hand, there are encouraging signs that not just that we or the community internationally and key governments also are not giving up, but that there is movements. These movements, as I mentioned, in some cases, group of countries, in parliaments, there is this growing engagement of national, international judiciaries and so on. So we just have to keep at it and just be very, in my view, it's important to be very realistic, and at the same time to have confidence that the cause is just and that therefore will prevail. Now, and this is my point. First, we have to be engaged in these things because it's a just cause. We owe it. We owe, I mean, as a non-Sahrawi, we owe it to these people. The organization owes it to these people, so one has to stand by them. The second reason to engage with this is that in general, all those who believe in a functioning system of international relations in support of international peace and security and development must support the Sahrawi cause. You know, we have to stand by the principles of the UN Charter of International Legality. For the Sahrawis, as in general, for striving for a world that is free of conflict, that is not run by realpolitik, that is not being trampled upon, because every time that an issue of this sort is not resolved, there can be a proliferation or as I said, a sense of impunity for other abuse elsewhere in the world. So fighting for the Sahrawi cause means to really fight for the overall set of values and principles of the UN Charter and the international community. So that's, I'm not running for office. Okay, thank you, Benjamin. Thank you all.